Forget toys and cartoons if you were a child in a medieval village. Your playtime meant chasing chickens, hauling water, scrubbing chamber pots, or picking lice out of your baby brother's hair. Before your feet could grow calluses, they were already covered in mud. Childhood wasn't carefree. It was chore-filled, cold, and absolutely exhausting. If this makes your childhood feel like a royal vacation, you're in for more sleepy perspective. Hit subscribe and tap the bell icon for more stories that make even bedtime feel luxurious, and tell us in the comments, which medieval chore would have broken you as a kid? When you imagine the life of a medieval village child, perhaps you envision carefree days spent playing in meadows or learning simple lessons from patient parents. But step closer to the reality of that time, and you'll discover that childhood, as we know it, barely existed. Instead, from the moment a child could walk steadily, usually around age 5 or 6, they became an essential cog in the relentless machinery of survival that kept medieval villages functioning. The most fundamental of all childhood tasks, one that shaped the rhythm of countless young lives, was the daily ritual of water carrying. This wasn't the simple matter of turning a tap or filling a glass that we know today. Water, the very essence of life, had to be transported bucket by bucket, trip by trip, from its source to every corner of human habitation. And this backbreaking, never-ending responsibility fell heavily upon the smallest shoulders in the village. Picture young Margot, perhaps 7 years old, standing at the edge of the village well as the first pale light of dawn creeps across the thatched roofs around her. The wooden bucket in her small hands is nearly as tall as her torso, its iron bands already cold and slippery with morning dew. The well rope, thick and rough with use, has worn grooves in the stone rim from countless years of bucket after bucket being lowered and raised. This scene, repeated in virtually every settlement across medieval Europe, represents one of the most tedious yet crucial tasks that defined childhood in that harsh era. The physics of water carrying created a particular burden for children. A single wooden bucket, when full, could weigh between 20 and 30 pounds, a substantial load for a small child to manage. The buckets themselves were crafted from oak or other hardwoods, bound with iron hoops to prevent splitting under the constant stress of being filled, carried, and emptied. But these wooden vessels were not completely watertight, especially as they aged, which meant that precious water would slowly leak out during the journey from well to home, forcing children to move quickly despite their burden. The wells that served as the village's primary water source were engineering marvels of their time, though they demanded constant maintenance and careful use. Most were hand-dug, sometimes reaching depths of 30 feet or more to access reliable groundwater. The sides were lined with stones to prevent collapse, and a wooden windlass system allowed buckets to be lowered and raised with relative ease, though this still required considerable strength and coordination that young children had to develop through daily practice. But not every village was fortunate enough to have a central well. Many children had to make daily pilgrimages to natural water sources, streams, springs, or ponds that might lie half a mile or more from their homes. These journeys were particularly arduous in winter, when paths became treacherous with ice and mud, or during summer droughts, when the nearest reliable water source might require an even longer trek. The water-carrying task began before most adults stirred from their beds. Children understood that the day's water needs were immense: cooking, cleaning, brewing, washing, and providing drink for both humans and livestock. A typical peasant household might require 50 to 70 gallons of water daily for all its needs, water that had to be transported one bucket at a time by small hands. The arithmetic was simple and relentless. If each bucket held approximately 2 gallons, and a child could manage to carry only one bucket at a time, they faced a minimum of 25 to 35 round trips every single day. The carrying Technique itself was an art form that children had to master through painful trial and error. The most efficient method involved balancing the bucket on the head, which distributed the weight more evenly and allowed for better posture during the long walk. However, this required exceptional balance and neck strength that took months or even years to develop. Younger children often had to resort to carrying buckets with both hands, which severely limited the amount they could transport and placed enormous strain on their developing backs and shoulders. The social dynamics of water carrying created additional layers of complexity in village life. Wells and water sources became gathering places where information was exchanged. Disputes were settled, and the day's gossip was shared. Children, while focused on their task, absorbed these adult conversations and learned the intricate social networks that governed their community. They discovered which families were struggling, which marriages were troubled, which crops were failing, all while waiting their turn at the well rope. Weather transformed the water-carrying task from merely difficult to genuinely dangerous. During winter freezes, well ropes became brittle and could snap without warning, sending buckets plummeting into the depths. Ice formations around wellheads created slippery surfaces that claimed many young victims, leading to broken bones or worse. Summer brought different challenges. Wells could run dry, forcing longer journeys to alternative sources, while extreme heat made the physical exertion even more punishing. The constant moisture exposure led to specific health problems that marked water-carrying children. Their hands developed permanent calluses from gripping bucket handles and rough rope, while their shoulders often showed asymmetrical development from consistently carrying loads on one side. Many suffered from what we would now recognize as repetitive stress injuries, though medieval understanding of such conditions was limited to accepting them as inevitable consequences of necessary work. Yet, perhaps the most profound impact of daily water carrying was psychological. Children learned, through their aching muscles and calloused hands, that survival was never guaranteed and always required effort. They understood viscerally that the clear, cool water they brought to their families represented the thin line between life and death in their precarious world. This knowledge shaped their character in ways that modern childhood cannot replicate, instilling a deep appreciation for resources that we now take for granted. As young Margot makes her first trip of the day, her bucket sloshing gently with each careful step, she carries more than water. She bears the weight of responsibility, the burden of necessity, and the knowledge that her family's day cannot truly begin until she has completed this essential task. But as the sun climbs higher and the village begins to stir around her, she might wonder, how many more trips will this day require? And what other challenges await once the water buckets are finally full? The morning's first water delivery marked only the beginning of a child's aquatic responsibilities that would stretch throughout the entire day. As households awakened and the medieval village came to life, the demand for water intensified exponentially, creating an intricate choreography of bucket carrying that children had to master with precision, timing, and unwavering reliability. Consider the brewing process that occupied so much of medieval household routine. Ale was the primary beverage for most people, including children, as it was often safer than water due to the fermentation process that killed harmful bacteria. A single batch of ale for a moderate-sized family required approximately 15 to 20 gallons of water that had to be heated, cooled, and transported at specific stages of the brewing cycle. Young girls, typically between 8 and 12 years old, learned to anticipate their mother's brewing schedules and ensure adequate water supplies were available at precisely the right moments. The washing routines of medieval households created another layer of water carrying demands that fell squarely on children's shoulders. Laundry day, which occurred weekly or bi-weekly depending on the family's circumstances, required enormous quantities of water for soaking, washing, and rinsing. A typical wash load for a peasant family might consume 40 to 50 gallons of water, all of which had to be heated over fires that were themselves maintained and fed by children. The logistics were staggering. Water had to be carried, heated, used for washing, then replaced with fresh water for rinsing, with each stage demanding multiple trips between water source and home. Personal hygiene, though less frequent than modern standards might suggest, still placed regular demands on the village's young water carriers. Monthly baths for family members required heated water, 20 to 30 gallons per person, that had to be transported and warmed in large cauldrons or wooden tubs. Children learned to gauge the precise temperature needed for bathing by testing water with their own hands, developing an almost supernatural ability to determine whether additional hot water was needed without burning their fingers in the process. The agricultural demands of water carrying extended far beyond household needs into the realm of livestock care. Cows, sheep, goats, pigs, and chickens all required daily water, and in many cases, this water had to be transported from distant sources to animal pens and pastures. A single cow might consume 30 to 50 gallons of water daily, depending on the season and her milk production status. Children learn to calculate these needs instinctively, understanding that thirsty animals produced less milk, laid fewer eggs, and were more susceptible to disease. The seasonal variations in water carrying duties created distinct rhythms that children had to adapt to throughout the year. Spring brought the challenge of muddy paths and unstable footing as winter frost gave way to soggy ground. Children developed techniques for navigating these treacherous conditions, learning to place their feet carefully and adjust their carrying posture to maintain balance on uncertain terrain. They discovered that certain types of footwear, typically wooden clogs or leather shoes with thick soles, provided better grip on muddy surfaces. Though such footwear was often beyond the means of poorer families, summer intensified the water carrying burden as wells began to run low and alternative sources had to be sought. Children became scouts and explorers, ranging farther from their villages to locate springs, streams, or other water sources that might supplement their community's dwindling supply. These expeditions required knowledge of the local landscape that children accumulated through years of exploration, understanding which paths led to reliable water and which were likely to prove disappointing. The social hierarchy of water access created complex dynamics that children had to navigate with diplomatic skill. Wells were often owned by the village lord or wealthier peasants who might charge fees or demand labor in exchange for water access. Children learned to negotiate these arrangements, understanding when to approach well owners with requests and how to demonstrate the proper respect that might ensure continued access to this precious resource. During times of scarcity, water rationing became a grim reality that children had to enforce within their own families. They learned to judge how much water was absolutely necessary for cooking, how much could be spared for washing, and what minimal amount would suffice for drinking. These decisions required a maturity far beyond their years, as children had to balance competing needs while understanding that their choices might literally determine their family's survival. The tools and techniques of water carrying evolved as children grew in strength and skill. Younger children might begin with small clay pots or wooden bowls, graduating to larger vessels as their capabilities increased. Some communities developed specialized carrying equipment, wooden yokes that distributed weight across both shoulders, or leather slings that allowed buckets to be suspended from the body in ways that reduced strain on growing bones and muscles. The quality control aspects of water carrying demanded that children develop sophisticated sensory skills. They learned to recognize the visual signs of clean water versus contaminated sources, understanding that certain colors, odors, or surface conditions indicated danger. They discovered which times of day produced the clearest water from various sources and how weather conditions affected water quality. This knowledge was literally life-saving, as contaminated water could devastate entire families with dysentery, cholera, or other waterborne diseases. The psychological burden of water. Carrying extended beyond the physical challenges to encompass a deep sense of responsibility for family welfare. Children understood that their diligence in water collection directly affected their family's health, comfort, and survival. This knowledge created a level of stress and anxiety that modern children rarely experience, as each trip to the well carried with it the weight of genuine necessity rather than simple chores. As the day progressed and shadows began to lengthen, young water carriers like Margot would begin their final rounds, ensuring that evening cooking needs were met and that sufficient water remained for the night's requirements. But even as these immediate needs were satisfied, the cycle would begin anew with the next dawn, creating an endless rhythm of labor that defined childhood in ways both profound and exhausting. The question that haunted every young water carrier, as they completed their daily rounds, was always the same. Would tomorrow bring relief, or simply more of the same relentless demand for the liquid essence of life? As medieval villages settled into their evening routines, the true scope of a child's water-carrying burden became most apparent in the accumulated toll of months and years spent in this essential service. The long-term effects of daily water transportation shaped not just individual children, but entire communities and generations, creating a legacy that extended far beyond the simple act of moving liquid from source to destination. The physical development of children who spent their formative years carrying water showed distinctive patterns that medical understanding of the time could not fully explain. Though the evidence was visible in every village, spinal curvature became common among young water carriers, particularly those who consistently carried heavy buckets on one side of their body. Their shoulders developed unevenly, with the carrying side often noticeably higher and more muscular than the other. Hand and wrist deformities were equally prevalent, as the constant gripping of bucket handles and well ropes created permanent changes in bone and joint structure. The most tragic cases were the children who suffered serious injuries during their water-carrying duties. Well accidents claimed young lives regularly, as children leaned too far over well edges or lost their footing on wet stone surfaces. Drowning was an ever-present danger, particularly when children had to collect water from ponds, streams, or rivers during winter months. Breaking through thin ice while attempting to reach water sources led to hypothermia and death. These tragedies were accepted as inevitable consequences of necessity, mourned but not prevented, as there were no alternatives to the system that demanded child labor for water collection. The economic impact of child water carriers on medieval village life was profound and multifaceted. Families that lost children to water-carrying accidents or injuries faced immediate crises, as the remaining family members had to absorb the lost labor while dealing with their grief. Communities sometimes had to reorganize their entire water collection systems when too many children were injured or killed, leading to changes in well locations, the construction of safer access methods, or the establishment of communal carrying arrangements that spread the burden among more families. The seasonal variations in water availability created periods of extreme stress that tested every child's endurance and resourcefulness. During severe droughts, water sources might be located miles from villages, requiring children to embark on day-long expeditions that carried significant risks. They might encounter wild animals, become lost in unfamiliar territory, or simply collapse from exhaustion during these extended journeys. The water they managed to transport under such conditions was precious beyond measure, often rationed so carefully that family members received barely enough to survive. Winter presented different but equally dangerous challenges. Ice-covered paths made every step treacherous, while frozen water sources required children to break through ice layers or seek alternative sources that might be even more distant. The physical strain of carrying water in heavy winter clothing, while navigating slippery conditions, led to frequent falls and injuries. Frostbite was common among children whose hands remained in contact with cold metal bucket handles for extended periods, sometimes resulting in permanent damage to fingers and hands. The social dynamics created by water scarcity revealed both the best and worst aspects of medieval village life. During times of abundance, children might play games around wells and water sources, turning their essential work into moments of joy and camaraderie. They developed songs and chants that helped pass the time during long carrying journeys, creating a shared culture of resilience and cooperation. But when water became scarce, these same social bonds could fracture as families competed for access to limited resources. The knowledge systems that children developed around water sources represented one of the most sophisticated aspects of medieval environmental understanding. Young water carriers became experts in reading weather patterns, understanding how rainfall, temperature changes, and seasonal variations affected different water sources. They could predict when wells might run dry, when springs would flow most freely, and which streams were most likely to maintain clean water during various conditions. This expertise was passed down through generations of children, creating an informal but highly effective system of environmental knowledge that helped communities survive. The psychological resilience required for daily rescue. Water carrying shaped character in ways that influenced entire lifespans. Children learned to persist through physical discomfort, to maintain focus during repetitive tasks, and to accept responsibility for outcomes that affected their entire family's welfare. These qualities, forged through years of carrying water, prepared them for the harsh realities of adult life in ways that formal education could never match. Yet the cost was often the loss of childhood itself, as play and imagination were subordinated to the relentless demands of survival. The gender roles, established through water carrying, had lasting implications for social organization. While both boys and girls carried water, different communities assigned this task according to various cultural patterns. In some villages, girls were considered naturally suited for water carrying and began the work earlier, while boys transitioned to other farm labor as they grew stronger. These early work assignments often determined life paths, influencing marriage prospects, social status, and economic opportunities throughout adult life. The technological innovations that emerged from water carrying necessity demonstrated medieval ingenuity in addressing practical challenges. Villages developed improved bucket designs, more efficient carrying yokes, and better well construction techniques in response to the daily struggles of their young water carriers. Some communities created systems of water storage that reduced the frequency of carrying trips, while others established cooperative arrangements that shared the burden. Among multiple families, the spiritual and cultural significance of water carrying extended beyond mere survival to encompass religious and social meanings. Water was understood as a divine gift, and children who carried it were sometimes seen as fulfilling sacred duties. Religious ceremonies often incorporated water that had been carried by young people, lending spiritual significance to their daily labor. Folk traditions and songs celebrated the dedication of young water carriers, preserving their stories in community memory as Margot completed her final water-carrying journey of the day, setting down her bucket with aching arms and reviewing the wells and paths that had consumed her childhood. She carried with her more than just the physical scars of her labor. She bore the knowledge that her work had been essential, that her community's survival had depended on her willingness to lift, carry, and transport the most basic necessity of life. The water she had carried would sustain her family through another day. But the cost measured in childhood, lost, body strained, and spirit-tested would remain with her forever. The legacy of medieval child water carriers extended far beyond their individual struggles to influence the development of entire civilizations, creating systems of resource management, community cooperation, and environmental understanding that shaped the foundations of the modern world. Their story reminds As that behind every drop of water we consume lies a history of human effort, sacrifice, and determination that spans generations. In the endless cycle of agricultural life that defined medieval existence, few tasks were as monotonous, backbreaking, and seemingly futile as the daily ritual of stone picking. Yet this tedious chore, performed by countless children across Europe, from the moment they could walk steadily until they grew strong enough for heavier farm work, represented one of the most crucial activities for ensuring agricultural survival. Every spring, as frost heaved new stones to the surface of plowed fields, and every season, as weather erosion exposed fresh obstacles, children faced the Sisyphean task of clearing their family's land, one rock at a time. The geological processes that created this burden for medieval children were relentless and unforgiving. Each winter's freeze-thaw cycle pushed stones upward through the soil, a natural phenomenon that medieval peasants observed but could not fully understand. What they knew with absolute certainty was that fields cleared of stones one season would inevitably sprout fresh crops of rock by the following spring, creating an annual cycle of clearing that seemed to mock human effort with its persistence. Picture young Willem, barely 8 years old, standing at the edge of his family's newly plowed field as dawn mist rises from the dark earth. The field stretches before him, perhaps 3 acres of churned soil that represents his family's primary source of sustenance for the coming year. To adult eyes, the field might appear ready for planting, but Willem's trained gaze immediately identifies the dozens upon dozens of stones that have emerged during the winter. Month stones that must be removed before a single seed can be safely sown. The stones themselves varied enormously in size, composition, and the challenge they presented to young workers. The smallest were mere pebbles, no larger than a child's thumb, that could be picked up by the handful and tossed into baskets or sacks. These might seem like the easiest targets, but their sheer numbers created an overwhelming task. A single acre of field might contain thousands of these small stones, each one requiring an individual motion to identify, bend down, grasp, and remove. The repetitive nature of this work created a hypnotic rhythm that could consume entire days. Bend, pick, toss, step, bend, pick, toss, step. In an endless cycle that tested both physical endurance and mental resilience, medium-sized stones, roughly the size of a child's fist or larger, presented different challenges. These required two-handed lifting and created strain on developing backs as children had to bend repeatedly to grasp stones that were often embedded partially in the earth. The weight of these stones, typically between 2 and 10 pounds each, meant that children could carry only a few at a time to the edge of the field where they were deposited in growing piles. The walking back and forth across the field, arms loaded with stones, created its own form of exhaustion that accumulated throughout long working days. The largest stones posed problems that often required creative solutions from young workers. Rocks that weighed 20, 30, or even 50 pounds were beyond the lifting capacity of most children. Yet they absolutely had to be removed before plowing and planting could proceed. Children learned to work in teams for these obstacles, with 2 or 3 young people combining their strength to wrestle massive stones from their resting places. They developed techniques using wooden levers, rope harnesses, and coordinated lifting that demonstrated remarkable ingenuity and cooperation. The tools available for stone picking were typically rudimentary, reflecting both the humble economic circumstances of peasant families and the perception that this work required more persistence than sophisticated equipment. Most children worked with their bare hands, developing calluses and cuts that marked them as seasoned stone pickers. Wicker baskets or cloth sacks served to collect smaller stones, while wooden sledges or crude wheelbarrows might be employed for transporting larger rocks to field edges. The timing of stone picking created additional pressure on young workers. This task had to be completed after spring plowing but before planting, creating a narrow window of opportunity that coincided with other urgent agricultural activities. Children often worked in dawn-to-dusk shifts during this critical period, understanding that delays in stone clearing could jeopardize the entire year's crop. The pressure was particularly intense because medieval farming operated on such narrow margins of survival that even small delays or inefficiencies could lead to family starvation. Weather conditions significantly influenced the stone picking. Experience, often making an already difficult task nearly unbearable. Rain turned fields into muddy quagmires where children slipped and fell while trying to extract stones from increasingly sticky soil. Their clothes became caked with mud, making movement even more difficult and adding weight to their already exhausted bodies. Hot, dry conditions created different problems, as hard-packed earth made it nearly impossible to extract embedded stones, while dust clouds stirred up by constant movement created breathing difficulties and eye irritation. The social dynamics of stone picking revealed both cooperation and competition among village children. Families with multiple children might organize stone clearing efforts as team activities, with older siblings supervising younger ones and establishing systems for efficient field coverage. Some villages developed community stone picking events where children from several families worked together, turning the tedious task into a social occasion with competitions to see who could clear the most area or collect the largest stones. The psychological impact of stone picking on young minds was profound and lasting. The seemingly endless nature of the task, combined with the knowledge that cleared fields would inevitably require clearing again the following year, created a particular form of childhood resignation that shaped character in fundamental ways. Children learned that much of life's work would be repetitive, unglamorous, and apparently futile, yet still absolutely necessary for survival. The educational aspects of stone picking extended beyond simple manual labor to encompass lessons in geology, agriculture, and environmental observation that served children throughout their lives. They learned to identify different types of stones and understand their implications for soil quality and farming success. They discovered how water drainage patterns affected stone distribution, how different soil types retained or released rocks, and how various farming techniques influence the stone regeneration cycle. The health consequences of intensive stone picking marked children's bodies in permanent ways. Chronic back strain from constant bending created posture problems that persisted into adulthood. Hand and finger injuries from sharp stones or heavy lifting were common, often leading to reduced dexterity and chronic pain. Knee and ankle problems developed from walking on uneven, stone-scattered terrain for hours at a time, while muscle strains and joint damage accumulated from the repetitive motions required for effective stone removal. The economic value of stone picking was both immediate and long-term, though rarely acknowledged in monetary terms. Clean fields produced better crop yields, reduced damage to plowing equipment, and allowed for more efficient planting and harvesting. The stones themselves often had economic value as building materials, fence construction components, or raw materials for village infrastructure projects. Children learned to sort stones according to their potential uses, understanding that their tedious labor was contributing to community development as well as agricultural necessity. As Willem surveys the field before him, calculating the hours and days of work that lie ahead, he faces a challenge that countless generations of children have confronted: the need to maintain hope and determination in the face of seemingly endless, repetitive labor. The stones scattered across his family's field represent more than agricultural obstacles. They embody the fundamental truth that survival requires persistent effort. That progress comes through small, individual actions repeated countless times. And that childhood in his world means accepting responsibilities that would overwhelm modern young people. But as he bends to collect his first handful of stones, Willem might wonder, What drives a child to persist in such seemingly hopeless work? And what happens to young people who spend their formative years in this endless battle against the earth itself? The daily rhythm of stone picking created a peculiar form of meditation that shaped the internal landscape of medieval children as profoundly as it altered the physical terrain of their families' fields. As days turned into weeks and seasons into years, young stone pickers developed mental strategies and physical techniques that allowed them to persist in work that might have broken less resilient spirits. The true measure of their achievement lay not in any single day's labor, but in the accumulated wisdom and endurance that emerged from this seemingly mindless repetition. The development of efficient, stone-picking techniques became a form of specialized knowledge passed down through generations of children within farming families. Experienced young workers learned to read the landscape with extraordinary precision, identifying the most productive areas to clear first and understanding the subtle signs that indicated where the largest or most numerous stones were likely to be found. They discovered that stones tended to accumulate in certain patterns based on water, drainage, soil composition, and previous farming activities. Knowledge that allowed them to work more strategically rather than simply wandering randomly across fields. The physical techniques of stone picking evolved into something approaching an art form among experienced child workers. They learned optimal bending and lifting postures that minimized back strain while maximizing efficiency. The most skilled stone pickers developed rhythmic movement patterns that conserved energy while maintaining steady progress, understanding how to coordinate breathing with physical effort to sustain work over extended periods. They mastered the art of tossing stones accurately over considerable distances, reducing the time spent walking back and forth across fields to deposit their finds. The social organization of stone-picking work revealed sophisticated forms of cooperation and division of labor among village children. Age-based hierarchies emerged naturally, with older children taking responsibility for the heaviest stones while younger ones focused on clearing smaller obstacles. Some families developed systems where children worked in lines across fields, ensuring complete coverage while maintaining social interaction that made the work more bearable. The most organized groups established quality control procedures, with designated children following behind the initial clearing crews to catch stones that had been missed. The seasonal variations in stone picking demands created distinct phases of childhood experience that were as predictable as the agricultural calendar itself. Spring stone picking, occurring immediately after plowing, was the most intensive and urgent, requiring children to work long hours under pressure to complete clearing before the narrow planting window closed. Summer stone picking involved clearing newly exposed obstacles after cultivation and weeding, while autumn picking focused on preparing fields for winter plowing by removing stones that had worked their way to the surface. During the growing season, the tool-making and equipment adaptation that emerged from stone-picking necessity demonstrated remarkable childhood ingenuity in addressing practical problems. Children learned to modify baskets and sacks to make them more suitable for stone collection, adding reinforcements to handles that would otherwise break under the weight of repeated loads. They developed crude but effective stone-carrying devices using cloth, rope, and wooden frames that distributed weight more evenly and allowed them to transport larger loads with less effort. The competitive aspects of stone picking created informal but intense rivalries among village children that added elements of play and achievement to otherwise tedious work. Children competed to see who could clear the largest area in a given time, who could collect the most impressive individual stones, or who could work longest without rest. These competitions served multiple purposes. They made boring work more engaging, established social hierarchies based on work capacity, and created informal training systems where successful techniques were demonstrated and copied by other children. The relationship between stone picking and broader agricultural knowledge created educational opportunities that were rarely recognized as such by medieval society. Children learn to observe soil conditions, understand drainage patterns, and recognize the signs of healthy versus problematic earth composition. They developed intuitive understanding of how different farming practices affected stone distribution and began to think strategically about land management in ways that would serve them. Throughout their lives as agricultural workers, the weather, adaptations required for effective stone picking under various conditions, demanded flexibility and resourcefulness that extended far beyond the immediate task. Children learn to work efficiently in mud, dust, heat, and cold, adapting their techniques and expectations to accommodate environmental challenges. They developed clothing and equipment modifications that provided protection while maintaining the mobility necessary for effective stone collection, often creating solutions from available materials when commercial options were unavailable or unaffordable. The psychological coping mechanisms that children developed to manage the monotony and apparent futility of stone picking revealed remarkable mental resilience and creativity. Many young workers created internal games, songs, or stories that provided mental stimulation during repetitive physical activity. They learned to find satisfaction in small achievements, clearing a particularly difficult area, discovering an unusually interesting stone, or working cooperatively with siblings or friends to overcome challenging obstacles. The long-term physical consequences of intensive stone picking became apparent as children matured into adolescence and adulthood. The most obvious effects were the development of exceptional strength and endurance in specific muscle groups, particularly in the back, arms, and legs. However, the repetitive strain also created characteristic patterns of wear and injury that marked experienced stone pickers throughout their lives. Spinal compression from constant bending, joint problems from repetitive motion, and hand deformities from gripping stones and tools were common outcomes that were accepted as inevitable costs of necessary work. The economic understanding that children developed through stone picking extended beyond the immediate agricultural benefits to encompass broader lessons about resource management and value creation. They learned that their labor had measurable economic impact on family welfare, that consistent effort produced cumulative benefits, and that seemingly small improvements in technique or efficiency could translate into significant gains over Q's. A's over Q's, combuting tellum, me, we are completed with some of selves, we are somely to complease telv, and they are complusely self, we are self, we are sully to suv, we are somewayed, we are sully, we are someway to suv, we someway sully to sark it out, we are sul by, it's unquickall lies, it's all it's unsealing like, it's a cookie cat. It's sicka to me to see lits, sit to compete dad it growth it ka it's to it kala it to big the tail of because that it cap me to cut the consist sits that may let it for the fits bake out of the best yes the best bit back it see that's time. These lessons in practical economics served them well in other aspects of medieval life, where similar principles applied. The relationship between stone picking and social status created complex dynamics within village communities. Children from poorer families often had to begin stone picking at younger ages and continue the work for more years than those from more prosperous households. The quality and quantity of stone-picking work became markers of family economic status, work ethic, and community standing. Children learned to take pride in their stone-picking abilities as demonstrations of their value to family and community welfare. The innovation and problem-solving aspects of stone-picking work encouraged creative thinking and practical experimentation that had applications far beyond agricultural labor. Children who excelled at finding efficient stone-picking solutions often demonstrated similar creativity in other areas of medieval life, developing reputations as practical problem solvers, whose skills were valued by their communities. The mental flexibility required to adapt to changing stone-picking conditions translated into broader ability that served them well in the uncertain and challenging world of medieval survival. As the seasons progressed, Willem's stone-picking skills developed through daily practice. He began to understand that his work represented more than simple field clearing. Each stone removed made a small but measurable contribution to his family's survival prospects. While the accumulated experience of thousands of stone-picking sessions was shaping his character, his understanding of work and persistence, and his place within the agricultural community that defined his world. But even as his expertise grew and his efficiency improved, the fundamental challenge remained unchanged. Tomorrow would bring new stones to clear, new fields to search, and new tests of the patience and determination that stone-picking demanded. The question that haunted every experienced stone picker was whether the endless nature of the work would eventually break their spirit, or whether they would find ways to derive meaning and satisfaction from labor that seemed to mock human effort. With its perpetual renewal, as years of stone picking accumulated in the lives of medieval children, the true scope and significance of their labor became apparent not just in the cleared fields they left behind, but in the fundamental transformation of both landscape and character that their work accomplished. The millions of stones lifted, carried, and relocated by countless young hands over generations created changes that extended far beyond agricultural convenience to encompass environmental modification on a scale that rivaled the efforts of adult workers with their plows, harrows, and construction projects. The cumulative impact of childhood stone picking on medieval agricultural productivity was profound and measurable. Though rarely calculated in the detailed economic terms that might quantify such contributions. Today, fields that were consistently and thoroughly cleared of stones produced markedly higher crop yields than those where stone removal was neglected or performed carelessly. The improved soil drainage that resulted from comprehensive stone clearing prevented waterlogging that could destroy entire harvests, while the removal of obstacles allowed for more efficient plowing patterns that maximized the use of available farmland. The stone walls, boundaries, and infrastructure that emerged from decades of child labor represented one of the most visible and lasting legacies of this seemingly mundane work. The stones gathered from fields didn't simply disappear. They were systematically repurposed into essential community infrastructure that shaped the physical and social organization of village life. Property boundaries marked with stone walls provided clear demarcation of land ownership and usage rights, while stone-lined drainage ditches and water channels created agricultural improvements that benefited entire communities for generations. The specialized knowledge that experienced stone pickers developed about their local environment contributed to broader understanding of land management and agricultural science that informed community decision-making for decades. Children who had spent years observing stone distribution patterns, soil conditions, and water drainage characteristics became informal experts whose opinions were valued when villages planned new fields, selected planting strategies, or addressed agricultural problems. Their ground-level understanding of land conditions often proved more accurate and useful than the theoretical knowledge possessed by adult authorities. The physical transformation of children who devoted their formative years to stone picking created distinctive populations within medieval villages, whose capabilities and limitations shaped community labor organization throughout their lifetimes. Young people who developed exceptional strength and endurance through years of stone picking often found themselves assigned to other physically demanding tasks throughout their adult lives, becoming the community's go-to laborers for construction projects, road maintenance, and other heavy work that required proven physical capability. The social hierarchies that emerged from stone-picking expertise created unexpected pathways for advancement within the rigid class structures of medieval society. Children who demonstrated exceptional skill, reliability, and leadership in organizing Stone clearing efforts sometimes attracted the attention of landowners or overseers who recognized their potential for more responsible positions. The management skills required to coordinate group stone picking efforts, allocate work efficiently, and maintain quality standards translated into valuable capabilities for supervising other agricultural activities. The economic calculations surrounding stone picking efficiency became increasingly sophisticated as communities recognized the genuine value of this child labor. Villages began to develop informal systems for measuring and comparing the productivity of different stone picking crews, understanding that more efficient clearing translated directly into improved crop yields and reduced equipment maintenance costs. The most successful stone picking teams were sometimes hired by neighboring families or communities, creating early forms of specialized child labor contracting. The seasonal rituals and celebrations that grew up around stone picking work reflected the community's recognition of its importance and the need to maintain morale among young workers. Some villages developed spring festivals that celebrated the completion of major stone clearing efforts, while others created competitions and games that acknowledged the achievements of particularly dedicated or skilled young stone pickers. These celebrations served multiple purposes. They provided incentives for quality work, created social bonds among child workers, and reinforced community values around the importance of agricultural labor. The technological innovations that emerged from stone picking necessity demonstrated the remarkable inventiveness that developed when children were given both motivation and freedom to solve practical problems. The most creative young workers developed improved tools, more efficient carrying methods, and better techniques for identifying and extracting difficult stones. Some of these innovations spread between villages through informal networks, creating a body of practical knowledge that enhanced stone picking efficiency across entire regions. The environmental consequences of large-scale stone removal became apparent over decades and centuries, as the accumulated labor of countless children literally reshaped the landscape in ways that were both beneficial and problematic. Cleared fields were more productive and easier to work, but the removal of stones also affected water drainage patterns, soil composition, and erosion control in ways that sometimes created new challenges for future generations. The stone walls and structures built from collected rocks became permanent features of the medieval landscape that influenced settlement patterns, property boundaries, and agricultural practices for centuries. The health outcomes for children who spent their formative years in intensive stone picking work showed both positive and negative effects that persisted throughout their lives. The physical strength, endurance, and coordination developed through this work provided significant advantages in other manual labor activities. While the outdoor exposure and physical activity contributed to overall health and resilience, however, the repetitive strain injuries, spinal problems, and joint damage that resulted from years of bending, lifting, and carrying heavy stones created chronic health problems that affected quality of life and work capacity in later years. The psychological legacy of childhood stone picking included both resilience and trauma that shaped adult personality and behavior in complex ways. The persistence, determination, and ability to find satisfaction in repetitive work that stone picking required served many individuals well throughout their lives, providing mental tools for coping with other challenging or monotonous tasks. However, the apparent futility of work that had to be repeated endlessly, combined with the physical discomfort and social isolation that often accompanied stone picking duties, also created forms of psychological damage that manifested as depression, anxiety, or resigned acceptance of difficult circumstances. The knowledge transfer systems that developed around stone picking expertise created informal educational networks that passed practical skills and wisdom from one generation of children to the next. Older siblings and cousins taught younger ones not just the physical techniques of effective stone picking, but also the mental strategies for coping with boring or difficult work, the social skills needed for cooperative labor, and the broader understanding of agricultural systems that made their work meaningful within the larger context of community survival. Asterisk. The gender roles and expectations that emerged from stone-picking work patterns varied significantly between communities, but generally reflected broader social attitudes about appropriate work for boys and girls. In some villages, stone picking was considered equally suitable for children of both genders, while in others, cultural norms assigned this work primarily to boys or primarily to girls based on local traditions and labor needs. These early work assignments often influenced lifetime career paths and social opportunities in ways that extended far beyond the immediate agricultural context. As Willem completed his final season of intensive stone-picking work, graduating, two other farm duties that required the strength and maturity he had developed through years of field clearing. He carried with him more than just calloused hands and a strong back. His understanding of land, weather, cooperation, and persistence had been shaped by countless hours spent in seemingly futile labor that had, in fact, contributed to his family's survival and his community's prosperity in ways that would become apparent only over decades of accumulated benefit. The stones he had removed from his family's fields had found new purposes in walls, foundations, and infrastructure that would serve future generations, while the fields themselves would produce better harvests for years to come as a direct result of his patient, repetitive labor. The lessons he had learned about work, responsibility, and the relationship between individual effort and community welfare would guide his decisions and actions throughout his adult life, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond the UHO. DHI beyond the UHL moves on the day and leaves a rich, long-lasting color, and the relationship between May with U.S. collabs, and the relationship between Mercure Malexa, we ease with May. They relieve sub, the les, convisit of May. We macade, we make a lady predestate, we made you, kaikade. It be a press it. I to see it to suka it I to see it to me it to make I li like it kakseta bb kagess it to su it did it to kai may lights pitzika to get to be spitly to with it to clipet be gets to keep it Boundaries of the fields he had cleared. The legacy of medieval stone picking extended beyond individual families and communities too, influenced the development of entire regions and agricultural systems. The accumulated labor of countless children, stone by stone and season by season, created agricultural landscapes that supported larger populations, more stable food supplies, and more prosperous communities than would have been possible without their dedicated work. Their story reminds us that history's great achievements often rest on foundations built through the small, repeated efforts of young people whose contributions were rarely recognized or celebrated, but whose persistence and dedication made possible the civilization we have inherited. In the vast expanse of medieval agricultural fields, where the survival of entire communities depended on successful harvests, a peculiar form of warfare was waged daily between human ingenuity and the relentless appetite of countless birds. At the front lines of this battle stood the most unlikely of soldiers, children, some as young as 6 or 7 years old, armed with nothing more than wooden clappers, stones, and their own voices, tasked with the exhausting and monotonous duty of protecting ripening crops from aerial assault, the economic necessity that drove communities to deploy children as human scarecrows reflected the razor-thin margins of survival that characterized medieval agricultural life. A single flock of hungry birds could devastate weeks of careful cultivation in a matter of hours, transforming promising fields of grain into stubble and destroying the food security that families depended upon for winter survival. The mathematics of loss were stark and unforgiving. Every grain consumed by birds was one less grain available for human consumption, and in a world where famine was an ever-present threat. Such losses could literally mean the difference between life and death for entire villages. Picture young Ulrich, barely 8 years old, standing in the center of a field of ripening wheat as the first gray light of dawn begins to illuminate the grain heads that wave gently in the morning breeze. The field stretches in all directions around him. Perhaps 5 acres of precious crop that represents his family's primary food source for the coming year. His equipment is simple, but essential. A pair of wooden clappers carved from oak, a leather pouch filled with smooth stones for throwing, and a voice that he will use hundreds of times before the day is done to shout warnings and threats at the birds that view his family's grain as their own natural bounty. The variety of bird species that threatened medieval crops was both diverse and seasonal, requiring young scarers to develop sophisticated understanding of avian behavior, feeding patterns, and deterrent strategies. Crows, with their intelligence and social organization, presented perhaps the greatest challenge, as they could quickly learn to recognize and avoid ineffective scare tactics while communicating successful feeding strategies to other members of their flocks. Sparrows and finches arrived in massive numbers that could overwhelm even the most vigilant child guardian, while larger birds like rooks and jackdaws possessed both the size to cause significant individual damage and the persistence to return repeatedly despite consistent human interference. The tools and techniques of bird scaring evolved through generations of childhood experimentation and adult observation, creating a sophisticated arsenal of deterrent methods that combined noise, movement, and psychological warfare in ways that demonstrated remarkable understanding of animal behavior. The wooden clappers that most children carried were carefully crafted instruments designed to produce the loudest possible sound with minimal effort, allowing young workers to maintain noise-making capacity throughout long working days. The design of these clappers varied by region and maker, but the most effective versions incorporated resonating chambers and precisely calculated striking surfaces that amplified sound production while reducing hand fatigue. Stone throwing represented another crucial skill that young bird scarers had to master, requiring not just accuracy and range, but also strategic understanding of when and where to deploy this more aggressive deterrent. Children learned to calculate distances, lead moving targets, and time their throws for maximum psychological impact on bird flocks. The stones themselves were carefully selected for optimal size, weight, and aerodynamic properties, with experienced scarers developing personal collections of preferred projectiles that they carried from field to field. The vocal techniques employed by bird scarers involved more than simple shouting, encompassing a range of sounds, calls, and verbal patterns that were designed to confuse, frighten, and discourage different types of birds. Children developed repertoires of effective sounds that included imitations of predator calls, human speech patterns that seemed to disturb feeding birds, and rhythmic chants that could be sustained for extended periods without causing throat damage. The most skilled young scarers could produce sounds that mimicked the alarm calls of various bird species, creating confusion within flocks that disrupted their feeding coordination and encouraged them to seek safer feeding areas. The working conditions that child bird scarers endured were particularly challenging because of the need for constant vigilance and immediate response to bird activity. Unlike many other childhood tasks that allowed for breaks, rest periods, or shared responsibilities, bird scaring required continuous attention from sunrise to sunset during critical periods of crop development. Children learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated approaching bird flocks changes in wind patterns that might bring birds from distant roosts, weather conditions that encouraged feeding activity, or times of day when particular species were most likely to visit crop fields. the seasonal patterns of bird scaring created intense periods of work that coincided with the most vulnerable stages of crop development. The period just before harvest was particularly crucial, as ripening grain presented maximum attraction to hungry birds, while any damage at this stage would result in immediate and irreversible crop loss. During these critical weeks, children might spend 12 to 14 hours daily in the fields, maintaining their vigilance against constant waves of potential raiders, while dealing with weather conditions that ranged from scorching heat to driving rain. The psychological challenges of bird scaring work were perhaps even more demanding than the physical requirements, as children had to maintain focus and motivation during work that was simultaneously crucial and apparently futile. No matter how effectively they protected crops during any given day, they knew that the next morning would bring fresh waves of hungry birds ready to test their defenses once again. The repetitive nature of the work, combined with the isolation that often characterized field duty, created mental strains that tested the resilience of even the most determined young workers. The social dynamics of bird scaring varied significantly, depending on field size, family resources, and community organization. Some children worked alone in small family plots, developing self-reliance and independence that served them throughout their lives, while others operated as part of coordinated teams that covered larger agricultural areas through systematic cooperation. The most organized communities developed rotation systems that allowed children to share the burden of bird scaring while ensuring continuous crop protection, creating early forms of collective labor organization that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of work management principles. The effectiveness of different bird scaring strategies varied not only with the skill and dedication of individual children, but also with environmental factors, crop types, and local bird populations that created unique challenges for each agricultural community. Fields located near forests or wetlands faced different types of bird pressure than those in open agricultural areas, while the specific grains or crops being protected influenced both the types of birds that posed threats and the most effective deterrent methods for discouraging them. The training and knowledge transfer systems that prepared children for bird scaring responsibilities involved both formal instruction from adults and informal learning through observation and practice. Experienced scarers passed on their understanding of bird behavior, effective deterrent techniques, and strategies for maintaining energy and focus during long working days. This knowledge included practical wisdom about which sounds were most effective against different bird species, how to position oneself for maximum field coverage, and when to escalate from noise-making to more aggressive deterrent methods. The economic recognition of bird-scaring work within medieval agricultural systems was often limited. Despite its crucial importance for crop protection, children who performed this work were rarely compensated directly for their efforts, though their contributions were understood to be essential for family and community survival. In some cases, particularly skilled or reliable bird scarers might be hired by other families to protect their crops, creating early forms of specialized child labor that provided both economic opportunities and recognition for exceptional performance. As Ulrich surveys the field around him, noting the first movements of birds in the distant hedgerows that signal the beginning of another day's battle, he faces challenges that will test not only his physical endurance and skill, but also his mental resilience and commitment to protecting his family's future. The grains he guards represent more than agricultural products. They embody the hopes, efforts, and survival prospects of everyone who depends on this harvest for sustenance through the coming winter. But as he raises his clappers and prepares to issue his first warning shouts of the day, Ulrich might wonder, what psychological toll does this constant warfare against nature exact on young minds? And what happens to children who spend their formative years in this endless battle against creatures that are tied in their own way, simply trying to survive? The mental landscape of a child tasked with bird scaring duty was shaped by a unique combination of hypervigilance, strategic thinking, and the peculiar stress that came from engaging in what often felt like a futile battle against the natural world. As days turned into weeks and seasons into years, young bird scarers developed psychological adaptations that were both remarkable in their sophistication and troubling in their implications for healthy childhood development. The state of constant alertness required for effective bird scaring created neurological changes in developing brains that influenced behavior patterns throughout life. Children learn to process multiple streams of sensory information simultaneously: visual scanning for approaching birds, auditory monitoring for the sounds that indicated feeding activity, and environmental awareness of weather conditions that might affect bird behavior. This heightened sensory processing ability served them well in many aspects of medieval life, but also created anxiety responses and hypervigilance that could persist long after their bird-scaring duties ended. The development of strategic thinking skills among young bird scarers was remarkable and demonstrated cognitive abilities that were rarely recognized or valued in other aspects of medieval childhood. Effective scarers learn to anticipate bird behavior patterns, predict feeding schedules based on weather and seasonal factors, and develop countermeasures for birds that had adapted to standard deterrent methods. They understood concepts of territory, resource competition, and behavioral modification that approach the sophistication of modern wildlife. Management principles: the social isolation that characterized much bird scaring work had profound effects on personality development and social skills that extended far beyond the immediate agricultural context. Children who spent long days alone in fields with only birds and crops for company developed different communication patterns, social expectations, and relationship skills than those who worked in more social environments. Some became exceptionally self-reliant and independent, while others struggled with social interactions and community integration that required different types of interpersonal skills. The creativity and innovation that emerged from the boring, repetitive nature of bird-scaring work demonstrated the remarkable adaptability of young minds faced with monotonous but important tasks. Children invented games, songs, stories, and mental exercises that helped them maintain focus and interest during long working days. They developed elaborate fantasies about the birds they fought, creating personalities and narratives that transformed simple pest control into complex psychological dramas that engaged their imagination and intelligence. The relationship between bird scarers and their avian adversaries evolved into complex psychological dynamics that resembled both warfare and dance. Experienced scarers developed detailed knowledge of individual birds and flocks, recognizing behavioral patterns, social hierarchies, and learning capabilities that allowed them to customize their deterrent strategies for maximum effectiveness. Some children reported developing almost personal relationships with particularly persistent or intelligent birds, creating ongoing psychological battles that added drama and engagement to otherwise routine work. The seasonal rhythms of bird scaring created distinct psychological phases that children had to navigate with varying degrees of success and stress. The intense pressure of pre-harvest protection, when crops were most vulnerable and bird pressure was highest, created periods of extreme mental and physical demand that tested every aspect of a young scarer's resilience. The relative quiet of winter months provided recovery time, but also created anxiety about preparing for the next season's challenges. The weather-related challenges of bird scaring added layers of psychological stress that went far beyond simple physical discomfort, working in rain, wind, extreme heat, or cold while maintaining the vigilance necessary for effective crop protection, required mental toughness and adaptability that pushed many children beyond their comfort zones. They learned to find psychological strategies for coping with environmental discomfort while maintaining focus on their primary responsibilities, developing resilience that served them throughout their lives. The development of auditory skills. among bird scarers was particularly remarkable, as effective work required the ability to distinguish between different types of bird calls, identify threats from beneficial species, and monitor bird activity across large areas through sound alone. Children developed almost supernatural hearing abilities that allowed them to detect approaching bird flocks long before they became visible, giving them crucial early warning time to organize their defensive responses. The moral and ethical dimensions of bird scaring work created psychological conflicts that many children struggled to resolve. On one hand, they understood the necessity of protecting their family's food supply and recognized that crop losses could lead to genuine starvation. On the other hand, they observed that the birds they fought were also trying to survive and feed their own young, creating empathy conflicts that added emotional complexity to their work responsibilities. The competitive aspects of bird scaring, when children worked in groups or when their effectiveness was compared to other scarers, created additional psychological pressures that influenced self-esteem, social status, and personal identity. Children who excelled at bird scaring gained recognition and respect within their communities, while those who struggled with the work faced criticism and reduced social standing that could affect their opportunities and self-perception throughout their lives. The innovation and problem-solving challenges that bird scaring presented encouraged creative thinking and experimentation that had applications far beyond agricultural pest control. Children who developed effective new techniques for deterring birds often applied similar creative approaches to other challenges they encountered, developing reputations as problem solvers whose skills were valued in various aspects of community life. The physical endurance requirements of bird scaring work created psychological relationships with fatigue, discomfort, and persistence that shaped character development in fundamental ways. Children learned to push through physical discomfort, maintain focus despite exhaustion, and find sources of motivation that sustained them through difficult working conditions. These psychological skills proved valuable throughout their lives, though they sometimes came at the cost of learning to recognize and respond appropriately to their own physical and emotional needs. The communication skills that developed among bird scarers were uniquely adapted to the requirements of their work environment. They learned to project their voices over long distances, create sounds that were effective for bird deterrence, and coordinate with other scarers across large areas, using calls and signals that were specifically designed for agricultural communication. These specialized communication abilities sometimes translated into leadership skills and social influence that served them well in other contexts. The memory and observation skills required for effective bird scaring were extraordinary and involved the ability to track multiple variables simultaneously over extended periods. Successful scarers remembered which deterrent methods had been effective against specific flocks, tracked seasonal patterns in bird behavior, and observed environmental changes that influenced feeding patterns and crop vulnerability. This detailed environmental knowledge became a valuable resource that benefited their families and communities throughout their lives. The stress management techniques that children developed to cope with the demands of bird scaring work included both healthy and problematic strategies that influenced their psychological development in complex ways. Some learned effective methods for maintaining calm focus under pressure, while others developed anxiety patterns or aggressive responses that created difficulties in other social situations as the psychological demands of bird scaring work accumulated. Over months and years, young workers like Ulrich found themselves changed in ways both subtle and profound. The constant vigilance, strategic thinking, and environmental awareness that their work required had shaped their minds into instruments of remarkable capability and endurance, though often at costs that wouldn't become apparent until much later in their lives. But even as their psychological adaptations allowed them to excel at their crucial work, fundamental questions remained. What long-term effects did this intense childhood responsibility have on adult personality and behavior? And how did communities balance the agricultural necessity of child bird scarers against the psychological costs of requiring such demanding work from their youngest members. The long-term ecological consequences of systematic bird scaring by medieval children created environmental changes that extended far beyond the immediate agricultural benefits, influencing regional ecosystems, wildlife populations, and landscape development in ways that shaped the natural world for generations. The accumulated impact of countless young voices, clappers, and stones had altered the relationship between human agriculture and natural systems in fundamental ways that demonstrated both the power and unintended consequences of sustained human intervention in natural processes. The bird population dynamics that resulted from decades of intensive scaring by children showed complex patterns of adaptation, displacement, and behavioral evolution that illustrated the remarkable ability of cute shit, a remarkable ability of cute. Ma cutes quate, ma bellity sedes. The bird population dynamics, they leave. Dio mescate / maluff. D cute / cutie. My cute / quate. My quate / quate, you see ca plead becued, ca pity of unslore resadate. Liets et, becog hide up at, both human and animal populations to respond to sustained environmental pressure. Bird species that had historically fed on agricultural crops developed new feeding strategies, altered their migration patterns, and evolved behavioral modifications that allowed them to coexist with human agricultural systems while still accessing necessary food resources. The territorial displacement of bird populations from agricultural areas to alternative habitats created ripple effects throughout regional ecosystems that influenced plant communities, insect populations, and predator-prey relationships in ways that extended far beyond the immediate vicinity of protected crop fields. Birds that were successfully deterred from agricultural areas often concentrated in forest edges, wetlands, and uncultivated areas where there increased feeding pressure, altered vegetation patterns, and competed with other wildlife species for limited food resources. The development of bird behavioral adaptations to human deterrent methods demonstrated remarkable intelligence and learning ability that created ongoing challenges for child scarers, who had to constantly innovate their techniques to maintain effectiveness. Some bird species learned to recognize individual human scarers and develop strategies for avoiding their most effective deterrent methods, while others adapted their feeding schedules to times when human vigilance was typically reduced or developed cooperative behaviors that overwhelmed individual scarers through coordinated group action. The acoustic ecology of agricultural landscapes was fundamentally altered by the constant presence of noise-making child scarers whose clappers, shouts, and other sounds created audio environments that influenced not just bird behavior but also the communication patterns, stress levels, and habitat preferences of numerous other wildlife species. The cumulative sound pollution generated by systematic bird scaring may have contributed to the displacement of sound-sensitive species while favoring those that could tolerate or adapt to increased noise levels. The technological evolution of bird deterrent methods showed progression from simple human presence to increasingly sophisticated techniques that expected both the ingenuity of child workers and the adaptive intelligence of their avian adversaries. The most successful deterrent innovations combined multiple sensory approaches, visual, auditory, and sometimes olfactory, that created more complex and difficult to threat environments for feeding birds while reducing the physical and psychological demands on human scarers. The seasonal effectiveness of different bird scaring techniques varied significantly based on food availability, weather conditions, and breeding cycles that influenced bird behavior in ways that required sophisticated understanding of ecological patterns. Children who became expert bird scarers developed detailed knowledge of these natural cycles that allowed them to predict periods of high bird pressure and adjust their deterrent strategies accordingly, creating informal but highly effective wildlife management systems. The community-wide coordination of bird scaring efforts in some villages created landscape-scale wildlife management programs that demonstrated remarkable sophistication in their understanding of territorial behavior, population dynamics, and resource competition. The most organized communities developed systematic approaches that protected multiple fields simultaneously while creating alternative habitat areas where birds could feed without threatening agricultural crops, showing early forms of wildlife conservation thinking. The economic calculations that emerged from analyzing the effectiveness of child bird scarers revealed the genuine value of this work in terms of crop protection, yield improvement, and food security benefits that justified the allocation of childhood labor to this specialized task. Communities that invested more heavily in systematic bird scaring typically achieved better agricultural outcomes and more stable food supplies than those that relied on less organized or less intensive protection methods. The health impacts of bird scaring work on children showed both positive and negative effects that influenced their physical development and long-term well-being in complex ways. The outdoor activity, physical exercise, and environmental exposure associated with bird scaring work contributed to general health and fitness, while the stress, isolation, and repetitive strain of the work created health problems that sometimes persisted throughout their lives. The social status and recognition accorded to successful bird scarers varied significantly between communities, but generally reflected the understood importance of their work for community welfare and agricultural success. Children who demonstrated exceptional skill, reliability, and innovation in bird scaring sometimes gained recognition and respect that plays influenced their opportunities for advancement and their social standing throughout their lives. The knowledge systems that developed around bird scaring work created informal educational programs that taught children about ecology, animal behavior, agricultural science, and environmental observation in ways that provided practical knowledge and skills that served them throughout their lives. The most successful bird scarers became informal experts whose understanding of local ecosystems and wildlife behavior was valued by their communities and sometimes led to roles in broader environmental management and agricultural planning. The psychological legacy of childhood bird scaring work included both resilience and trauma that influenced adult personality, behavior patterns, and relationships with the natural world in ways that shaped individual life trajectories and community cultural development. Some former bird scarers developed lifelong interests in wildlife observation and environmental stewardship, while others retained anxiety or aggressive responses toward wildlife that reflected the stressful nature of their childhood. Work responsibilities. The innovation and creativity that emerged from bird scaring challenges led to technological developments and problem-solving approaches that had applications beyond agricultural pest control. Children who excelled at developing new bird deterrent methods often applied similar creative thinking to other technical challenges they encountered throughout their lives, contributing to broader technological and social innovation within their communities. The gender roles and expectations that developed around bird scaring work varied between communities but generally reflected broader social attitudes about appropriate work assignments and capability expectations for boys and girls. These early work experiences often influenced lifetime career paths and social opportunities in ways that extended far beyond the immediate agricultural context. As Ulrich completed his final season as a primary bird scarer, transitioning to other agricultural duties that reflected his growing size and strength, he carried with him more than just memories of long days spent shouting at birds and protecting grain. His understanding of wildlife behavior, environmental patterns, and the complex relationships between human activity and natural systems had been shaped by years of intimate observation and interaction that few adults could match. The skills he had developed in strategic thinking, environmental awareness, and persistence under pressure would serve him throughout his life. though the psychological costs of his childhood vigilance would also remain with him as permanent. Reminders of the price of survival in his unforgiving world. The legacy of medieval child bird scarers extended beyond individual agricultural protection to encompass fundamental changes in regional ecosystems, wildlife populations, and human environment. Relationships that influence the development of entire landscapes and communities. Their story illustrates the complex ways in which human survival needs intersected with natural systems, creating changes that persisted long after the individual workers had moved on to other responsibilities and challenges. In the perpetual twilight of medieval homes, where windows were few and small, and artificial lighting was a precious commodity reserved for special occasions, fire represented far more than simple warmth or cooking convenience. It was the very heart of domestic life, the source of light, heat, food preparation, and protection that made human habitation possible during the harsh realities of medieval existence. And at the center of this crucial responsibility stood the youngest members of each household, children who learned, often before they could properly walk, that their family's survival depended on their ability to maintain the sacred flame that played discord and must never be allowed to die. The economic necessity that placed fire-tending duties in the hands of children reflected both the critical importance of continuous flame maintenance and the practical limitations of medieval fuel resources. Firewood, charcoal, and other combustible materials represented significant household expenses that required careful management and conservation to ensure adequate supplies throughout long winter months. A fire that was allowed to die meant not only the immediate loss of warmth and cooking capability, but also the expensive and time-consuming process of rekindling flame using the primitive fire-starting methods available to medieval households. Picture young Gwyneth, perhaps 6 years old, crouched beside the central hearth of her family's one-room cottage as the first gray light of dawn seeps through the shuttered windows. The embers from the previous night's fire glow faintly in the ash, representing both hope and responsibility that will define her entire day. Her small hands, already marked with the small burns and calluses that identify experienced fire tenders, hold pieces of carefully selected kindling that must be placed with precision and timing to coax the dying embers back to full flame without smothering the precious spark that represents her family's lifeline. The technical skills required for effective fire maintenance were far more complex than modern people might imagine, encompassing detailed knowledge of wood types, burning characteristics, airflow management, and fuel conservation that represented sophisticated understanding of combustion principles. Different types of wood, burned at different rates and temperatures, produced varying amounts of smoke, and created different types of coals that were suitable for different household purposes. Children learned to distinguish between hardwoods that provided long-lasting coals for overnight heating and softwoods that ignited quickly for cooking tasks. Understanding which fuels were appropriate for different times of day and different household needs, the daily rhythm of fire tending created a complex schedule of responsibilities that began before dawn and continued until the final banking of coals that would, hopefully, maintain spark until the next morning's rekindling. The morning revival of flame required careful assessment of the previous night's coal bed, strategic placement of tinder and kindling, and gentle breath application that could coax reluctant embers back to life. Too much air could scatter the coals and extinguish the spark, while too little would allow the embers to die completely, necessitating the difficult and time-consuming process of starting fire from scratch. The fuel preparation tasks that supported continuous fire maintenance required children to develop detailed knowledge of wood selection, cutting techniques, and storage methods that ensured adequate supplies of properly seasoned combustible materials. Green wood, cut too recently to have dried properly, produced excessive smoke and poor heat while consuming rapidly and inefficiently. Seasoned wood, aged for months or years until its moisture content was reduced to optimal levels, burned cleanly and efficiently, but required advanced planning and storage space. That challenged household management capabilities. The fire-starting Kyo. Techniques available to medieval households were primitive, labor-intensive, and required skills that children had to master through patient practice and accumulated experience. The most common method involves striking flint against steel to create sparks that could ignite carefully prepared tinder made from char cloth, dried fungi, or other combustible materials that would catch fire from the smallest spark. This process required precise timing, proper materials, and considerable patience, as multiple attempts were often necessary before achieving successful ignition. The safety challenges associated with fire tending created constant dangers that claimed young lives regularly throughout medieval communities. House fires were common and devastating, often triggered by careless fire management, inadequate containment systems, or simple accidents that occurred when tired or distracted children made errors in judgment or technique. Burns were inevitable consequences of fire tending work, ranging from minor injuries that marked but did not disable, to severe burns that could permanently damage hands, arms, or faces of young fire tenders. The cooking responsibilities that accompanied fire tending required children to master the complex art of medieval food preparation, which involved understanding how different foods required different types of heat, timing, and cooking techniques. Bread baking required steady, even heat that could be maintained for hours, while meat roasting needed intense heat that could be adjusted throughout the cooking process. Porridge and stew preparation demanded consistent low heat that could simmer ingredients without burning, requiring constant attention and frequent stirring to prevent disasters that could waste precious food resources. The heating management. Aspects of fire tending involved understanding the thermodynamics of medieval buildings and the most efficient methods for distributing warmth throughout living spaces that were typically poorly insulated and subject to significant heat loss. Through crude construction techniques, children learned to direct heat flow using simple tools and techniques, understanding how to position screens, adjust dampers, and manage air circulation to maximize heating efficiency while conserving fuel resources. The social dynamics of fire tending created hierarchies and responsibilities that influenced family, relationships, and childhood development in fundamental ways. Older children typically supervise younger ones in fire-related tasks, creating teaching relationships that pass down essential survival skills while establishing patterns of authority and responsibility that would influence social behavior. Throughout their lives, reliability and skill that children demonstrated in fire tending often determined their status within the family and their eligibility for other important responsibilities. The seasonal variations in fire tending demands created distinct patterns of work and responsibility that reflected the changing needs of households throughout the agricultural year. Winter fire tending was most demanding, requiring constant attention to maintain heating, longer cooking times for preserved foods, and careful fuel management to ensure adequate supplies throughout the cold season. Summer fire tending focused more on cooking needs while managing heat production to avoid overheating living spaces during warm weather. The tools and equipment used for fire tending were typically simple but essential items that children had to master and maintain as part of their daily responsibilities. Bellows for increasing airflow, pokers for manipulating burning materials, tongs for handling hot objects, and various containers for ash removal and fuel storage. All required proper use and care to ensure effective fire management and household safety. The psychological burden of fire tending responsibility created stress and anxiety that influenced childhood development in ways that were rarely recognized or addressed by medieval society. Children understood that their negligence or errors could result in family death from cold, starvation from inability to cook food, or destruction of the home and all possessions through fire accidents. This level of responsibility placed on shoulders that were often too young to fully comprehend the consequences of their actions. created psychological pressures that shaped personality development and stress responses throughout their lives. The knowledge transfer systems that taught fire tending skills to successive generations of children involved both formal instruction and informal learning through observation and practice. Parents and older siblings passed down essential techniques, safety procedures, and troubleshooting methods that enabled children to handle the complex challenges of fire management. This knowledge included understanding of fire behavior, fuel characteristics, safety protocols, and emergency procedures that could prevent disasters and ensure continuous household operation. As Gwyneth carefully arranges her kindling and prepares to begin another day of fire tending responsibilities, she faces challenges that will test not only her technical skills and knowledge, but also her ability to maintain focus and reliability under the constant pressure of protecting her family's most essential resource. The flame she tends represents more than mere fire, embodies the continuity of her family's survival, the warmth of their shelter, and the very possibility of continued existence in a world where the margin between life and death was often as thin as the difference between glowing coals and cold ash. But as she bends close to the hearth and begins the delicate process of coaxing flame from ember, Gwyneth might wonder what happens to children who grow up carrying such enormous responsibility for family survival, and what psychological and physical costs does this constant vigilance exact from young people who must never allow themselves to forget that their family's life depends on their unwavering attention to the sacred fire. The mastery of fire that medieval children were required to develop extended far beyond simple flame maintenance to encompass a sophisticated understanding of combustion science, resource management, and household chemistry that would challenge modern adults accustomed to the convenience of instant heating and cooking. As children progressed from basic fire tending to advanced fire management responsibilities, they acquired technical knowledge and practical skills that represented genuine expertise in one of humanity's most fundamental technologies. The fuel economics that governed medieval fire management required children to develop detailed understanding of resource allocation, conservation strategies, and efficiency optimization that influenced every aspect of household operations. Wood was expensive and often scarce, particularly during harsh winters when demand exceeded supply and families competed for limited resources. Children learned to calculate burning rates, understand which types of wood provided the most heat per unit of cost, and develop strategies for stretching fuel supplies during periods of scarcity. This economic awareness influenced their fire management decisions throughout each day, as they balanced immediate heating and cooking needs against long-term resource conservation requirements. The advanced fire management techniques that experienced child fire tenders developed demonstrated remarkable sophistication in their understanding of thermodynamics, airflow control, and combustion optimization. They learned to create different types of fires for different purposes: quick hot fires for rapid cooking tasks, slow steady fires for long-term heating, and carefully controlled fires for specific food preparation techniques that required precise temperature management. The ability to predict and control fire behavior became second nature to skilled young fire tenders, who could adjust flame intensity, heat distribution, and burning duration through subtle manipulations of fuel arrangement and airflow. The cooking chemistry that children mastered through their fire tending responsibilities involved understanding how different temperatures affected various foods, how cooking times related to fire intensity, and how to achieve consistent results despite the variable nature of wood-burning fires. Bread baking required maintaining steady temperatures for extended periods, often achieved by heating the oven intensely and then allowing it to cool gradually while the bread cooked in the residual heat. Meat preparation involved understanding how different cuts required different cooking approaches, from quick searing over high heat to slow roasting in carefully controlled thermal environments. The seasonal adaptation strategies that fire tenders Employed demonstrated their ability to modify their techniques based on changing environmental conditions, fuel availability, and household needs throughout the agricultural year. Winter fire management emphasized heating efficiency and fuel conservation, often requiring children to maintain fires continuously for months while carefully rationing wood supplies. Summer fire tending focus on cooking needs while minimizing heat production, requiring different fuel choices and burning techniques that provided adequate cooking capability without overheating living spaces. The emergency procedures that children learned for fire-related crises encompassed both fire suppression techniques for controlling dangerous blazes and fire restoration methods for rekindling flames that had been accidentally extinguished. Fire suppression involved understanding how to smother flames using sand, water, or other materials while preventing the spread of fire to combustible household materials. Fire restoration required mastery of various ignition techniques, from flint and steel spark creation to friction-based fire-starting methods that could produce flame even when conventional materials were unavailable. The health and safety protocols that developed around fire-tending work reflected hard-won knowledge about preventing accidents and treating burn injuries that were inevitable. Consequences of working closely with open flames. Children learned to recognize the signs of dangerous fire conditions, understand proper clothing and positioning for fire-related work, and apply basic first aid treatments for burns and smoke inhalation. The most experienced fire tenders developed intuitive understanding of fire behavior that allowed them to anticipate and avoid dangerous situations before they developed into serious accidents. The tool maintenance and care responsibilities that accompanied fire tending required children to understand metalworking principles, food preservation techniques, and basic repair skills that kept essential fire management equipment in working condition. Bellows required regular maintenance too. Ensure proper airflow, while pokers, tongs, and other metal tools needed protection from rust and damage that could render them ineffective. The ability to maintain and repair fire-tending equipment was often as important as the fire management skills themselves, as broken tools could make effective fire tending impossible. The social coordination aspects of fire management in larger households required children to work together in teams that shared responsibilities while maintaining clear hierarchies and communication systems. Older children typically supervised younger ones, creating mentorship relationships that passed down essential skills while establishing patterns of cooperation and authority. The most complex fire management operations involved coordinating multiple fires for different purposes simultaneously, requiring communication and teamwork skills that served children well in other aspects of medieval life. The innovation and problem-solving challenges that fire tending presented encouraged creative thinking and experimentation that led to improved techniques and equipment designs. Children who discovered more efficient burning methods, developed better fuel preparation techniques, or created improved fire management tools often shared their innovations with family members and community members, contributing to gradual improvements in fire technology that benefited entire communities. The environmental awareness that effective fire tending required encompassed understanding of weather patterns, air quality conditions, and seasonal changes that affected fire behavior and household heating needs. Children learned to predict how wind, humidity, and temperature changes would influence fire management throughout the day, adjusting their techniques accordingly. This environmental sensitivity contributed to broader understanding of natural patterns that served them well in other aspects of agricultural life. The resource procurement responsibilities that supported fire tending often required children to participate in wood gathering, fuel preparation, and storage activities that extended their understanding beyond immediate fire management to encompass the entire fuel supply chain. Wood gathering expeditions taught children about forest ecology, tree species identification, and sustainable harvesting practices that ensured continued fuel availability. Fuel preparation involved understanding seasoning requirements, storage techniques, and quality assessment methods that determine fire performance and efficiency. The psychological adaptations that children developed to cope with the constant responsibility and potential dangers of fire tending included both healthy, resilient strategies and problematic anxiety responses that influenced their personality development. The most successful fire tenders learned to maintain calm focus under pressure while developing confidence in their abilities to handle emergency situations. However, the constant awareness of potential disaster also created anxiety patterns and hypervigilance that could persist throughout their lives. The quality control standards that children applied to their fire tending work reflected understanding of the relationship between technique, consistency, and outcomes that influenced family welfare and safety. They learned to recognize the signs of properly managed fires, understand when adjustments were needed, and maintain standards of performance that ensured reliable results. This attention to quality and consistency became habitual patterns that influenced their approach to other work responsibilities. Throughout their lives, the training progression that prepared children for increasingly complex fire tending responsibilities involved systematic skill development that began with simple tasks and gradually expanded to encompass full fire management capabilities. Young children might begin by gathering, kindling, or arranging fuel, progressing through various levels of responsibility until they could independently manage all aspects of household fire needs. This progressive training system ensured that essential skills were passed down reliably, while preventing dangerous situations that could result from inadequate preparation. As the demands of fire tending accumulated over months and years, children, like Gwyneth, found themselves transformed by the constant vigilance, technical expertise, and psychological resilience that their responsibilities required. The fire management skills they developed represented genuine mastery of complex technology, while the habits of careful observation, resource management, and emergency preparedness served them throughout their lives in ways that extended far beyond simple fire tending. But even as their expertise grew and their confidence increased, fundamental challenges remained. How did the constant responsibility for family survival affect their psychological development? And what long-term consequences resulted from spending childhood years in such close proximity to both the life-giving warmth and potentially deadly dangers of open flame? The culmination of years spent tending fires created in medieval children a unique form of wisdom that combined technical mastery, psychological resilience, and philosophical understanding of the relationship between human effort and survival, in ways that shaped their character throughout their entire lives. The accumulated experience of managing flame, conserving resources, and accepting responsibility for family welfare forged personalities that were marked by both exceptional capability and the particular forms of stress that came from carrying such enormous responsibility from such early ages. The long-term physical consequences of childhood fire tending were visible in the bodies of adults who had spent their formative years in close proximity to open flames and the repetitive motions required for effective fire management. Burn scars were universal among former fire tenders, ranging from small marks on fingers and hands to more extensive injuries that had resulted from serious accidents during their childhood years. The constant exposure to heat and smoke had created respiratory problems in many cases, while the repetitive motions of stoking, arranging fuel, and managing fire tools had led to joint problems and muscle development patterns that marked them. As members of this specialized childhood occupation, the economic impact of skilled fire tending on family welfare was profound and measurable, though rarely calculated in specific monetary terms by medieval households. Families with exceptionally skilled young fire tenders consumed less fuel, experienced fewer cooking failures, and maintained more comfortable living conditions than those whose fire management was less efficient. The fuel savings alone could represent significant economic benefits over the course of long winter seasons, while the improved cooking outcomes reduced food waste and enhanced nutrition that contributed to better health and productivity for entire families the technological innovations that emerged from years of childhood experimentation with fire management techniques contributed to gradual improvements in medieval heating and cooking technology that benefited entire communities. Children who discovered more efficient fuel arrangements developed better airflow management techniques, or created improved fire starting methods often shared their innovations with neighbors and relatives, creating informal networks of technical knowledge transfer that enhanced fire management capabilities across entire villages. The environmental understanding that experienced fire tenders developed through years of close observation of combustion processes, fuel characteristics, and seasonal variations created a form of practical science that was remarkable in its sophistication and accuracy. They understood intuitively many principles of chemistry, physics, and ecology that would not be formally described by scientific theory for centuries. This practical knowledge included understanding of airflow dynamics, heat transfer principles, and resource management concepts that demonstrated genuine scientific thinking applied to practical survival challenges. The social leadership skills that often developed among children who excelled at fire tending reflected the natural authority that came from mastering essential survival skills and demonstrating reliability under pressure. Other children and even adults often looked to skilled fire tenders for guidance in technical matters. Crisis management and resource allocation decisions that extended beyond immediate fire management to encompass broader household and community challenges. This early leadership experience often influenced career paths and social roles throughout their adult lives. The risk assessment and crisis management capabilities that fire tending required created exceptionally mature judgment and decision-making skills that served former fire tenders well in many other aspects of medieval life. They learned to recognize warning signs, anticipate potential problems, and respond effectively to emergency situations in ways that demonstrated remarkable maturity and competence. These skills were particularly valuable in a world where survival often depended on making correct decisions quickly under pressure. The psychological resilience that developed through years of managing fire-related responsibilities created personality traits that were both admirable and problematic in their implications for personal happiness and social relationships. The constant vigilance, responsibility, and stress of fire tending often produced adults who were exceptionally capable and reliable, but also anxious, hypervigilant, and sometimes unable to relax or enjoy leisure activities. The habits of constant alertness and responsibility that were essential for effective fire tending could become psychological burdens that made it difficult to experience the simple pleasures and relaxation that contributed to personal happiness. The knowledge transmission systems that preserved and passed down fire tending expertise created informal educational networks that were remarkably effective at maintaining essential survival skills across generations. Former fire tenders often became the primary teachers of fire management techniques to the next generation of children, creating continuous chains of knowledge transfer that preserved crucial technical knowledge and cultural wisdom. The teaching methods they developed were often sophisticated and effective, combining hands-on demonstration, graduated responsibility, and safety instruction that ensured reliable skill development. The community integration that resulted from fire tending expertise often led to broader social roles and responsibilities that extended well beyond individual household management. Skilled fire tenders might be called upon to help neighbors during emergencies, assist with community cooking projects, or provide technical expertise for village-wide activities that required fire management skills. This community recognition and responsibility often led to social status and influence that shaped their position within village hierarchies throughout their adult lives. The philosophical perspectives that developed through years of managing. The essential element of fire created worldviews that emphasize the importance of human effort, the fragility of safety and comfort, and the need for constant vigilance against the forces that threaten survival. Former firetenders often developed deep appreciation for basic comforts like warmth and cooked food that others took for granted, while also maintaining realistic understanding of how quickly security could be lost through negligence or accident. The gender role implications of fire tending responsibilities varied significantly between communities, but generally influenced expectations and opportunities for both boys and girls who had demonstrated exceptional skill in this essential area. In some cases, fire tending expertise led to opportunities for advancement or specialized roles, while in others, it simply confirmed expected competency in essential survival skills. The specific ways that fire tending experience influenced adult opportunities depended largely on community values and economic structures that varied considerably across medieval Europe. The health outcomes for adults who had spent their childhood years as firetenders showed complex patterns that reflected both the benefits and costs of their early experiences. The physical fitness that came from active work, the problem-solving skills that developed through technical challenges, and the stress management capabilities that emerged from handling constant responsibility often contributed to better overall health and life outcomes. However, the respiratory problems from smoke exposure, the joint problems from repetitive motion, and the psychological stress from constant responsibility also created health challenges that persisted throughout their lives. The innovation and creativity that had been encouraged by fire-tending challenges often continued to influence former fire-tenders throughout their adult lives, making them valuable contributors to technological and social innovation within their communities. The problem-solving approaches, experimental thinking, and practical creativity that they had developed as children proved valuable in many other contexts. From agricultural innovation to craft development to community organization challenges, the legacy of medieval child fire tenders extended far beyond their immediate households to influence the development of heating and cooking technology, community organization patterns, and cultural values that emphasize the importance of reliability, technical competence, and responsibility for community welfare. Their accumulated knowledge and innovations contributed to gradual improvements in living standards and survival rates that benefited entire communities and regions. As Gwyneth completed her final years as a primary fire tender, transitioning to adult responsibilities that built upon but extended beyond her childhood expertise, she carried with her more than just technical knowledge and burn scars. Her understanding of responsibility, resource management, and the delicate balance between human effort and natural forces had been shaped by years of intimate relationship with the element that represented both life and death in medieval households. The skills she had developed, the wisdom she had gained, and the character traits she had forged in the crucible of childhood fire tending would influence every aspect of her adult life, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond the simple act of maintaining flame. The story of medieval child fire tenders illustrates the complex ways in which survival necessities shaped childhood experience, personality development, and social organization in ways that created both remarkable human capability and significant personal costs. Their legacy reminds us that behind every basic comfort we enjoy lies a history of human effort, sacrifice, and determination that spans generations, and that the skills and wisdom required for survival often come at prices that are not immediately apparent but shape entire lives and communities in fundamental ways. The 10 miserable tasks that defined childhood in medieval villages, from the endless labor of water carrying to the relentless vigilance of fire tending. From the seemingly futile work of stone picking to the psychological warfare of bird scaring created a form of childhood that was unrecognizable by modern standards, yet fundamental to the survival of entire civilizations. These young workers, some as young as 5 or 6 years old, carried responsibilities that would overwhelm most adults today, and their accumulated labor, sacrifice, and determination shaped not only their own character, but the very foundations of the world we have inherited. Each task, whether it involved lifting heavy buckets of water dozens of times daily, spending endless hours clearing fields of stones that would inevitably return, standing guard against hungry birds through long summer days, or maintaining the sacred flames that kept their families alive through harsh winters, represented more than simple childhood chores. These were the building blocks of civilization itself, the unglamorous, repetitive, back-breaking work that made possible the agricultural surpluses, the stable communities, and the accumulated knowledge that allowed human society to develop. Beyond mere subsistence, the children who performed these tasks were shaped by them in ways both profound and permanent, developing physical capabilities, psychological resilience, and practical wisdom that served them throughout their lives while also bearing the costs of responsibility assumed too young. Childhood sacrifice to necessity, and bodies and minds marked by the relentless demands of survival. Their stories remind us that progress often rests on foundations built through the small, repeated efforts of young people whose contributions were rarely recognized or celebrated, but whose persistence and dedication made possible the civilization we now inhabit. The legacy of these medieval child workers extends far beyond the specific tasks they performed to encompass broader lessons about human resilience, the relationship between individual effort and community survival, and the complex ways in which survival necessities shape personality, social organization, and cultural development. Their experience illustrates both the remarkable adaptability of young people faced with overwhelming challenges and the costs that such adaptation exacts from those who must grow up too quickly in worlds where childhood is a luxury that few can afford in our modern world of convenience and comfort, where water flows from taps, heat comes at the touch of a button, and food appears on shelves without visible effort. It is easy to forget the accumulated human effort that made such convenience possible. The story of medieval village children and their miserable but essential tasks provides a sobering reminder of how recently in human history survival required the kind of constant, back-breaking labor that we have largely forgotten, and how much we owe to the countless young people who carried the burden of their families and communities' survival on their small but determined shoulders.